Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I am doing my Elizabeth obsession. More specifically, since I talk about the books that I read initially about Elizabeth, sort of sporadically, I decided I would do a video that talks about the books that, well, threw me into my obsession with Elizabeth I. There's 5 that I have right now. One of them is part of, well, 2 of them are part of a series, but I'm just going to talk about the first book, and then if you're interested you can go check out the series because it's part of a series. Let's get into it. The first book I read in 6th or 7th grade. It might have been 7th. I can't remember if I reread it for the presentation or initially read it for the presentation, but either way, that is Beware Princess Elizabeth by Caroline Meyer. This is a series of, I want to say 6 books, but this one is the first I read, and obviously it's about Princess Elizabeth. It takes place from 1547 when her father dies until, it's been a long time since I've read this, oh wow, until 1558 when Mary dies and Elizabeth takes the throne. This was the first book I'd ever read about her, and I just sort of fell oh my goodness, I can't speak today, head over heels for this princess who was 15, give or take, when her father died and was 25 when she took the throne, and survived so much in between there, and essentially on her own because what else could she do? The admiration that I felt for her has never abated, obviously, or I wouldn't be here talking about the books that got me into my current obsession. But I then read the one about her mom, Doomed Queen Anne, and loved that one. I have to say I don't like the one about Catherine of Aragon as much. The one about Mary is pretty good. Mary Bloody Mary is what it's called. And there are several in the series that I have not read because I didn't realize it was more than 4 books, but it turns out it is. Anyway, this is definitely middle grade, and my copy is well loved. At some point it got wet, and I'm not sure when or how that happened, so it's got these nice wavy pages. But this is also the first time I learned about a lot of Elizabeth's quotes. There's a couplet, I guess you would call it, that Elizabeth allegedly scratched into the walls or the glass at Woodstock, which is where she was kept in part during her sister's reign, which says, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be." She was put in Woodstock because she couldn't be executed, because that wasn't going to set a good precedent, and the people loved her too much, and Mary was scared that she would be overthrown. So she just kept her in Woodstock and away from everybody who was trying to overthrow Mary anyway. Anyway, this is the first book. I did a presentation on this in 7th grade. I must have read it in 6th grade, because in 7th grade I had the costume for it, like Halloween costume, full out Elizabeth. It's got the ruffs and everything, and I still have that costume because I like it. But this is the first book. Next we have Elizabeth I, Red Rose of the House of Tudor, which is part of the Royal Diaries series. I never do know who these are by, but Catherine Lasky. There we go, it's by Catherine Lasky. So this one starts in June of 1544, July 1544, sorry, which is about 3 years before her father dies. He dies January of 1547. So in 1544, Catherine Parr is her last stepmother, and things are starting to calm down a little bit, although then Catherine almost gets arrested for heresy and blasphemy, and then outsmarts Henry because she's brilliant, and it's a whole big thing. But anyway, I really liked this one because it gave me more of an insight than Beware Princess Elizabeth. This one, it's short and it covers 10 years. So this was a really good introduction into 10 of the probably more harrowing years of Elizabeth's life. But the diary, fictionalized though it may be, gave me more of an insight into Elizabeth and really sort of stoked that ember that had been fired up by this book. I absolutely love this one. I could relate to a lot of it, not in the sense of being a princess or being important enough to have people plotting to put me on the throne, obviously, but just in the sense of being a teenager and trying to get your parents to outwardly admit they love you when you don't feel like that's working. I mean, in hindsight, obviously they do, but when you're a teenager, hormones are raging and everything is just a mess and your life is ending every day. And I really appreciated being able to read this, and these two books and what I knew about Elizabeth from them are a very large part of my personality today. I took on a lot of Elizabeth's traits, as much as I could. So I really enjoyed this one as well. The next one is the reason I understand more about Mary Queen of Scots. I still don't like her, I still don't agree with her ruling style. I think she was somewhat dumb, which is misleading. I think she was actually a very intelligent woman. I just think she was not groomed to rule, and because of that I think she led with her heart, not her head, which is her biggest problem because it ended up with 3 husbands, one of whom was murdered and the last of whom probably murdered her second one. Anyway, that book is Queen's Own Fool by Jane Yolen and Robert Harris. This book follows Mary Queen of Scots through the eyes of her fool. I believe her fool in this book is a completely fictional character, if I remember correctly, but having heard about Mary, even vaguely, in these books, because in this one I think Henry VIII is trying to marry off Mary to his son Edward at the time. And in this one it's just sort of a, well, we'll put Jane Grey on the throne because we can't have a Catholic like Mary Queen of Scots. So having heard her mentioned briefly in these 2 books, this one gave me a whole nother perspective into what else was going on in the Tudor family, although Mary is a Stuart, complicated family tree, and around the world at the time, because I didn't have a lot of ideas. I was reading Talking to Dragons and the Boxcar Children and Bailey's School Kids at the time I was reading these 2. I think I'd started branching out by then, but I still wasn't quite to the breadth that I have now, and so this gave me more of an insight into the woman who would ultimately become Elizabeth's top rival. Didn't end well, but I really like this book as well, again, because it gave me that insight, because it gave me all of the major events, Mary being in France, Frances dying, her moving to Scotland, David Rizzio's murder, marrying Darnley, not in that order, the troubles with Elizabeth being locked up in Lochleven, having to abdicate to her 1-year-old son, marrying Bothwell, again, not necessarily in that order, just all of this stuff that was going on during Elizabeth's reign, but that I didn't know about because the other 2 books were young Elizabeth. And so I found that fascinating, and it broadened my view of Elizabeth's reign and the problems that she was facing. Then we get into more adult books, starting with The Poison Garden by Karen Harper. This is the start of a 9-book mystery series, and this one starts with Elizabeth as princess. I believe it's toward the end of her sister's reign. Yes, toward the end of her sister's reign. They don't always tell you when exactly the year is. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Okay, so this one there's a prologue that says she wants to be called to the Queen's Chambers, and then the first chapter starts 5 years later and Elizabeth is still a princess. So this takes place during Mary's reign and then ends with Elizabeth becoming queen. And then the next 8 books take place during various points of Elizabeth's 44-and-a-half-ish year reign. This series presented Elizabeth as a human and gave her a whole other aspect. Don't get me wrong, I realize Elizabeth didn't go around solving mysteries. She didn't have time. But it's really fun to read about a monarch who does things that you just really enjoy. I mean, I can't solve mysteries, and Lord knows I wouldn't want to, but it's fun to live vicariously through them. And so to see Elizabeth develop in this way and to see her relationship with all of these different people, it also introduced me, again, to a whole wide cast of characters that did actually exist. It is not always historically accurate. For example, Catherine Grey? There's Grey sisters during Elizabeth's reign. Both of them marry and piss off Elizabeth because they didn't ask permission and they have a pretty good claim to the throne. Don't do that. But it might have been Mary. Either way, one of the Grey sisters had some sort of physical, I don't want to say disability because I don't think it was, but she was very, very short. And she married a man who was about 6'4", which is crazy tall at the time. It turns out he was sent to the tower and essentially broken there and then released, and about a year later he died. She was put under house arrest. She had a okay life, but that relationship was not, it was portrayed later on in this series, but not accurately. He never gets sent to the tower. So I did find that really fascinating. I enjoyed learning about all these other characters, and I enjoyed learning about the environment and the atmosphere in which Elizabeth lived, because I think these books do a really good job about that, and so this helped to, again, open my eyes and make me realize I wanted to learn everything I possibly could about specifically Elizabeth, but also other members of her family. And by other, I mean all of them. And the last book, I'm sorry, it's the movie cover, but that is The Other Boleyn Girl. I read this, I might have read this in between Queen's Fool and A Poison Garden, but I read this right about when the movie came out, whenever the devil that was, and I liked it. Knowing what I know now, it's very not inaccurate, but it was a good book. It was something I hadn't read about before, which was Mary Boleyn and Anne Boleyn and their relationship with Henry, because that was complicated. And so I enjoyed learning more about Elizabeth's family. It was, I think, if not the first book, one of the first books that I read about not specifically Elizabeth, that wasn't Mary Queen of Scots, but specifically Elizabeth's sort of immediate family. And I did enjoy the movie. Nowadays, I much prefer the Tudors. I just like the actors and actresses better, and I think it's, while again, not accurate and definitely oversexed, it's more accurate than The Other Boleyn Girl and more fun. So I read this book when the movie came out. I enjoyed it, and it helped set more of a foundation for my knowledge of Elizabeth's family and then broadening my scope. I realized that pretty much all of those were just, this broadened my view, this broadened my view, but that's what it did. I started very narrowly and then just kept growing until I'm here. So those are 5 of the books, the 5 biggest books, I would say, that got me to where I am in my obsession with Elizabeth I. I hope you enjoyed. If you've read any of those or have any thoughts, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!